They never warn you about the silence that follows. Not the kind that fills an empty house after the children have gone, but the kind that settles over a police interrogation room, thick, stale, and heavy with other people's despair. In Clearwater Bay, Florida, the air in those small rooms is always the same, cooled by overworked air conditioners, tinged with the bitter scent of burnt coffee that's been sitting on a hot plate for hours. At 74, I sat beneath a flickering fluorescent bulb, facing a detective whose salt and pepper mustache looked like it had given up trying to impress anyone years ago. The light caught the edge of a stainless steel scalpel lying quietly on the table between us. My right hand rested beside it. On my left, I held something far more delicate, the velvet ring box that had once symbolized 46 years of marriage. When they burst through the bedroom door earlier that evening, I hadn't screamed, argued, or protested. I'd simply looked at the lead officer and said, with a steady voice, "What you're looking for is in here." Then I'd set the box down on the dresser, right next to the watch they'd given Rick for selling a record number of yachts in a single year. People assume I wanted him dead. Death would have been far too easy, far too merciful. No, I wanted Richard Grant to wake up every morning for the rest of his life and see exactly what his 46 years of deceit had cost him. So if you're watching, baby, go ahead and like this video, comment where in the world you're watching from, and make sure to subscribe so you don't miss tomorrow's story. 'Cause this ain't just my story, it's the story of too many women who had to smile through the silence. My name is Eleanor Grant. Ellie to the few who still matter to me. And today, I'm no longer the dutiful supporting character in someone else's life story. If you're listening from anywhere in the world, hear me when I say this. Some truths need to be dragged into the light, no matter how many illusions they shatter. Some stories, no matter how ugly, have to be told, if only so the next woman knows when to stop swallowing her suspicions and start listening to her instincts. I married Richard Rick Grant, a man who began his career selling second-hand boats on the docks of Sarasota and ended up owning one of the largest luxury yacht dealerships on Florida's Gulf Coast. We raised 2 children. Daniel, now a cardiologist in Miami, and Claire, a graphic designer in New York. On the surface, we were the quintessential success story. 2 kids in private schools, a house with a view of the bay, charity gala invitations arriving weekly. Summers were for trips to the Keys or the Bahamas. Rick was the kind of man people gravitated toward. Tall, effortlessly charming, with that easygoing Gulf Coast drawl that made every sentence sound like an invitation. He wore tailored linen suits and carried stories the way other men carried pocket change, always ready to pull one out and toss it into a conversation. Nobody, not even me, the woman who shared his bed, could have guessed what was really behind that smile. I was born in 1950 in a small inland town outside Ocala. My parents, Harold and Lorraine, ran a modest hardware store. We weren't wealthy, but we never went without. My older brother, Samuel, and I learned early the value of work. While other little girls played dress-up, I hovered over my mother's well-worn medical books. She'd been a nurse before she married my father, and her cabinet of remedies fascinated me. Neatly labeled jars of salves, vials of iodine, stacks of clean bandages. When I was 9, I asked her how she knew what to use for each injury. She smiled, smoothed my hair back, and said, "Ellie, nursing is about knowing what you're looking at and acting before it gets worse. You don't wait for the wound to speak, you read the signs." That sentence never left me. In high school, while my classmates dreamed of being wives, secretaries, or teachers, I dreamed of the crisp white of a nurse's uniform and the quiet precision of an operating theater. My parents encouraged me. even when neighbors raised their eyebrows. My father liked to say, "Education's the only inheritance worth leaving, Ellie." My mother would add, "No man will carry you better than your own two hands." I graduated at the top of my class in 1968 and earned a scholarship to a nursing program in Clearwater Bay. It was a world away from my quiet hometown, salt in the air, boats lining the marinas, streets alive with tourists in loud shirts and louder laughter. The first months were overwhelming. My tiny rented room smelled of mildew, and my roommates and I lived on instant noodles and diner coffee. But I adapted. I studied like my life depended on it, taking every extra shift I could get in the surgical ward. By my second year, I was assisting in procedures most nurses didn't touch until their fourth. I wasn't just learning medicine, I was learning discipline. Timing. The value of precision when a patient's life hangs on your next movement. After graduation, I stayed in Clearwater Bay. By 27, I'd become head surgical nurse at St. Mary's Medical Center. A few years later, I bought into a small walk-in clinic that specialized in wound care and post-operative recovery. That clinic became my pride. It was where I practiced not just medicine, but the art of reading people, their pain, their hesitations, their truths hidden in body language. And then, one evening in 1979, the marina held an event to launch a new luxury yacht line. My clinic had partnered with local businesses to provide first aid kits for the vessels, and I went to represent our team. That was the night I met Rick Grant. Rick moved through the crowd like a man who had never been told no in his life. He greeted everyone, dockhands, millionaires, and reporters alike, with the same firm handshake and easy smile. When he was introduced to me, he actually kissed my hand. "It's an honor to meet Clearwater Bay's most skilled nurse," he said, his eyes warm and amused. I rolled my own internally. Men had tried flattery before, but something about his delivery felt deliberate, yet sincere. We ended up talking for almost an hour about everything from boat engines to medical emergencies at sea. He listened like my words mattered, a quality I would later realize was part of his salesmanship, not his soul. As the sun set and the champagne flowed, I felt a strange recognition. Not love at first sight, but a quiet voice saying, "This one will change everything." That voice was right, but not in the way I imagined. Rick called the very next morning. Not a text. Not a polite, "I'll see you around." He called, like a man who'd already decided where this was going. "I know it's short notice," he said, his voice carrying that easy Florida drawl, "but there's a cafe by the docks that makes the best key lime pie in the county. And it just so happens I have a table booked for two." I almost said no. I'd worked a 12-hour shift the day before and had a full schedule ahead. But there was something about his confidence, not arrogance, just certainty, that made me agree. That pie was the first of many shared meals. Rick didn't believe in slow burns. He'd pick me up after shifts, sometimes with flowers, sometimes with fresh seafood he'd cooked himself. He remembered details, my preference for black coffee, the brand of pen I liked for writing patient notes, the story about my mother's first stethoscope. Within a month, he'd introduced me to his parents, a warm, modest couple from a small town in Georgia who'd moved to Florida when Rick was a teenager. His father had worked as a mechanic in a marina. His mother cleaned houses for extra money. Rick had built his empire from scratch, and he wore that fact like a badge. 3 months into dating, he gave me a diamond ring. There was no "will you marry me?" Just him sliding the velvet box across the table one night and saying, "I've already told everyone you said yes." That should have been a warning. Decisions with Rick were rarely up for debate. But at the time, I found his certainty intoxicating. We were married on a sunny May afternoon in 1980, on a deck overlooking Clearwater Bay. The guest list was a strange mix: yacht club members in pastel blazers, my old nursing school friends in their sensible shoes, and half the marina staff in pressed uniforms. Rick insisted on sparing no expense: a live band, an open bar, fresh flowers everywhere. I'd have been content with something smaller, but I let him have his way. After all, I told myself, these were the kinds of compromises marriage required. The early years were good. Rick worked long hours at the dealership, and I continued running the clinic. We'd meet in the evenings over dinner, swapping stories about impossible clients and last-minute emergencies. He was proud of me, or at least, he seemed to be. He bragged to his friends about my skill, my work ethic, my independence. We bought a bayfront house with tall windows that caught the morning sun. We took trips to the Bahamas, Savannah, even Italy. And when our son, Daniel, was born in 1983, Rick surprised me. I'd expected him to be distant, too busy or too tired, but he was there in the delivery room, holding my hand, pale but determined. He painted the nursery himself in soft seafoam green, and assembled the crib without a single curse word. 2 years later, Claire arrived. With 2 children and 2 thriving careers, we looked like the picture of success. And maybe, for a while, we were. It's funny how small cracks can go unnoticed when life is loud and full. At first, it was the late-night calls Rick would take in the kitchen, his voice low. "Client in another time zone," he'd say. "Urgent paperwork." There were business trips that popped up without warning. Once, he was supposed to be in Tampa for a meeting, but I found a hotel receipt from Miami. His explanation, a last-minute location change, was delivered with such easy confidence that I almost believed it myself. When I'd question him about working so much, he'd grin and hand me a gift. Jewelry, designer handbags, a weekend getaway. "Making up for lost time," he'd say. I told myself it was the price of ambition. That's how successful men operated, constantly chasing the next deal, the next expansion. And Rick's business was booming. By the early 90s, he'd opened 2 more dealerships, expanded into selling luxury charter packages, and was negotiating exclusive rights with European yacht makers. His name started showing up in the society pages, often alongside mine. But there were moments, little flashes, when I'd catch a shadow in his expression, a flicker that made me wonder what lay behind the easy smile. One evening stands out like a splinter you can't quite get out. It was our 20th wedding anniversary. I'd made reservations at our favorite waterfront restaurant, arranged for the kids to stay with my brother, even bought a new dress. Rick called at 6 to say a deal in Fort Lauderdale was running late. "We'll celebrate tomorrow," he promised, his tone smooth as polished teak. I sat alone at the table for 2, watching other couples toast and laugh, until I couldn't take it anymore. I drove home, reheated leftovers, and poured myself a glass of wine. Around 9, my elderly neighbor, Mrs. Patel, knocked on the door. She'd seen me pull in alone and, without asking questions, brought over 2 cups of chai. We sat in the small garden I'd planted out back, sipping in silence. "Some burdens," she finally said, "are too heavy to share. But even in silence, you are not as alone as you feel." It was a simple kindness, but it kept me afloat more times than I care to admit in the years that followed. From the outside, nothing seemed wrong. Daniel and Claire were excelling in school. My clinic had expanded into a larger space, with 2 other nurses and a part-time doctor on staff. Rick's dealerships were raking in profits. We attended charity galas, hosted holiday parties, and were regulars at the yacht club. If there were cracks in our marriage, they were hidden beneath layers of public smiles and carefully rehearsed small talk. But by the early 2000s, Rick's absences were more frequent, his explanations thinner. And in 2004, the real fracture came not from him, but from my own body. It was a Tuesday when my doctor called me back into his office. "Eleanor," he said gently, "you have stage 2 breast cancer." The word cancer lands like a stone in the chest. I nodded, numb, as he outlined the surgery and the chemotherapy schedule. Rick came home early that day, something he hadn't done in months. He held me in the kitchen, told me we'd fight it together. For a while, he made good on that promise, rearranging his schedule, accompanying me to appointments, talking to the kids on my behalf when I was too tired. I thought maybe the illness would remind us both what mattered most. That maybe, just maybe, it would stitch up some of the tears in the fabric of our marriage. But I was wrong. Chemotherapy has a way of stripping life down to the barest essentials. In the months after my diagnosis, my world became a carousel of hospital chairs, 4 drips, and the quiet beeping of machines. I learned to measure time not by weeks, but by the rhythm of my treatments. The 3 days after each infusion when I could barely stand, the 5 days after that when food tasted like metal, and the short window before the cycle began again when I almost felt like myself. Rick was there at first. He'd drive me to the clinic, crack jokes with the nurses, hold my hand as the drugs slid into my veins. He brought flowers after every session, bright, extravagant bouquets that looked almost out of place in the sterile corners of our home. But as the weeks dragged on, something shifted. It started with small absences. "I've got to take this call," he'd say, stepping into the hallway for 30 minutes at a time. Or he'd duck out to run an errand before my appointment, only to arrive halfway through. Then came the business trips that coincidentally fell on my treatment weeks. "It's just one night," he'd promise, kissing the top of my head. "I'll be back before you know it." At first, I believed him. I even defended him when friends quietly asked if I was managing on my own. "He's doing his best," I'd say. "He's got a lot on his plate with the business." The truth was harder to admit. When you're sick, you want the person you love most to see you at your weakest and still choose to stay. But Rick, he didn't like weakness. It was during my 3rd round of chemo that I caught the first real glimpse of the life he was living beyond my sight. One Thursday evening, I went to bed early. The medication left me nauseous and bone-tired, and the house was blissfully quiet. Sometime around midnight, I woke to the sound of his voice downstairs. Low. Careful. I slipped on my robe and padded halfway down the staircase. "Yes, I miss you too," he was saying. His tone was warm, warmer than it had been with me in weeks. "No, don't worry. She's fine. I'll see you soon." The hairs on my arms rose. I stayed frozen on the step until I heard him end the call. Then I turned, climbed back into bed, and lay staring at the ceiling. The next morning, he told me he'd been speaking to a European supplier. I nodded like I believed him, but a splinter of doubt had lodged itself deep under my skin. My lumpectomy was scheduled for late spring. Daniel flew in from Miami to be there, and Claire managed to get time off work in New York. Rick was supposed to meet us at the hospital at 6 a.m. He didn't arrive until nearly 9, blaming traffic from the other side of the bay. I tried not to let it matter. I told myself he was there now, and that was what counted. But as they wheeled me into the operating room, I realized I'd stopped expecting him to be where I needed him most. The surgery was successful. My oncologist was optimistic. But recovery was long, and by the time I was strong enough to return to the clinic, I felt like a guest in my own marriage. By the summer of 2005, Rick was gone more than he was home. When he did appear, he was full of stories about deals, clients, and opportunities. He was attentive enough in public, but in private he seemed distracted. There were moments when I'd catch him staring at his phone, smiling faintly, his thumbs moving fast. If I entered the room, he'd set it down, face down, and change the subject. I wanted to confront him, but I didn't have the strength. My body was still recovering, my hair only just beginning to grow back. The last thing I wanted was another fight to drain what little energy I had. When my oncologist finally told me I was in remission, I felt relief, yes, but also a strange, hollow guilt. I'd spent months fighting for my life, and in the process, something else had died quietly between us. We didn't celebrate. Rick was in Palm Beach closing a deal the day I got the news. He sent a text that read, "Proud of you, Ellie. We'll do something soon." Soon it never came. The years between my remission and 2022 passed in a strange blur. Daniel and Claire built their own lives, and I buried myself in the clinic. Rick's business expanded further, and his name carried weight in every marina from Tampa to Key West. We kept up appearances, dinners at the yacht club, Christmas cards with carefully staged family photos, vacations where we spent more time with acquaintances than with each other. There were moments when I almost convinced myself the worst was behind us. That whatever he'd been hiding was a phase, a midlife itch he'd scratched and moved past. But deep down, I knew better. It happened on a sweltering July afternoon in 2022. Rick had been at the marina office all morning. According to his assistant, he'd been laughing with a client one moment and clutching his head the next. By the time the ambulance arrived, his speech was slurred, and the right side of his face had begun to droop. When I got the call, I dropped everything and drove straight to Clearwater Bay Medical Center. Seeing him lying there, pale and confused, triggered something unexpected in me. Not the rush of protective love I might have felt decades ago, but a cold, clinical awareness. The doctors said it was a minor stroke. With medication and rehab, he'd recover most of his abilities. But for now, he was grounded. No travel. No late nights. No business meetings. That meant, for the first time in years, Rick Grant would be under the same roof as me day and night. In the first week after he came home, I tried to play the dutiful wife. I prepared his meals, monitored his medication, and kept track of his appointments. But when you live in the same space with someone around the clock, you start noticing things you've overlooked for years. One afternoon, while looking for his insurance paperwork, I opened the drawer in his study desk. Beneath a layer of neatly stacked documents, I felt something solid, a thin, hidden panel. I pressed along the edge until it clicked open. Inside was a small, leather-bound notebook and a key on a silver ring. The notebook was filled with names, dates, and addresses, none of which I recognized. The addresses were all within a 20-mile radius. The names, all women. The notebook felt heavier than it should have, like every name inside was weighted with something I didn't want to carry. I told myself to put it back, to shut the drawer, close the panel, and go on pretending. But once you've opened one hidden compartment, it's almost impossible to unlearn the sound of that click. That night, I waited until Rick was asleep before slipping the notebook into my bag. His stroke had made him restless. He woke several times a night, mumbling half-formed words. But he didn't stir when I left the room. The first entry in the book was a name, Samantha Hale, followed by an address in a gated condo complex near the marina. I drove there the next afternoon under the excuse of running errands. The guard at the gate didn't question me when I said I was visiting a friend. Samantha's apartment was on the 3rd floor. The door was ajar, sunlight spilling into a space that smelled faintly of perfume and salt air. I knocked. A young woman appeared, mid-20s, long hair tied back in a loose braid. She looked at me with polite confusion. "Yes. I think we might have a mutual acquaintance," I said, testing the waters. "Rick Grant." Her face tightened, not with shock, but with the guarded expression of someone deciding how much to reveal. "He's a mentor," she said after a moment. "He runs the Future Horizons program. Helps women break into the boating industry." I glanced past her. The apartment was sparsely furnished: a couch, a coffee table, a large framed photograph of her standing on the deck of a yacht, smiling. I thanked her, wished her luck, and left. But my pulse was thudding in my ears. 2 days later, I visited the next address, a small studio above a boutique in downtown Clearwater Bay. This time, there was no hesitation. The door was unlocked, and inside was a makeshift office, a desk littered with folders, a whiteboard with dates and initials, a camera on a tripod pointed at a plain backdrop. I opened one of the folders. Inside were headshots of women, some in business attire, others in swimsuits, along with application forms for the Future Horizons program. At the bottom of each form was a familiar signature: Richard J. Grant. It wasn't just mentorship. He was recruiting, photographing, cataloging. The last address in the notebook was a 2-story bungalow on the edge of town. This one was different: no sign of an office, no glossy photographs. Instead, it looked lived in. A bowl of fruit on the counter, a throw blanket draped over the couch, the faint hum of a ceiling fan. I walked through the rooms, my steps slow and deliberate. In the bedroom, I found a dresser drawer filled with neatly folded clothes, none in Rick's size, all belonging to women much younger than me. A framed photo on the nightstand caught my eye: Rick, grinning, his arm around a woman I'd never seen before. She looked barely out of college. The bile rose in my throat. Back in my car, I sat gripping the steering wheel, the Florida heat pressing in through the windshield. I thought about Samantha's carefully neutral tone, the studio with its catalog of faces, the bungalow with its lived-in intimacy. This wasn't about one affair or even a handful of them. Rick had built an entire network, recruiting young women under the guise of career mentorship, placing them in apartments he controlled, and keeping meticulous records of it all. It was systematic, organized, deliberate. And it had been going on for years. Rick's business empire had given him everything he needed to hide it: legitimate travel for client meetings, easy access to waterfront properties, a steady stream of women looking for work in a competitive industry. The Future Horizons program sounded respectable, even admirable, to anyone who didn't know better. He'd probably been praised for it at yacht club dinners, toasted for giving back to the next generation. But now I know the truth. And I knew something else, too. If I turned this over to the police right now, the women involved would be dragged into a spotlight they didn't ask for. Their names, faces, and histories would be picked apart by strangers. Rick would survive the scandal, even if his reputation took a hit. Men like him always did. No, I wasn't going to hand him over to a system that would let him keep most of what he'd built. If justice was going to be served, it would have to come from me. That evening, I returned to the house, my mind buzzing with possibilities. Rick was sitting in the den, a blanket over his lap, flipping channels. He looked up as I entered. "Where've you been?" "Clinic paperwork," I said smoothly, setting down my bag. He nodded, turning back to the TV. He didn't notice the way I lingered in the doorway, watching him. Didn't see the way my eyes traced the shape of his hands, the curve of his throat, the space between us that I'd once thought unbridgeable. That night, I lay awake long after Rick had fallen asleep. I thought about the women in the photographs, about the younger version of myself, fresh out of nursing school, who might have fallen for his charm if I hadn't met him in a different context. I thought about my mother's words when I was 9. You don't wait for the wound to speak, you read the signs. The signs had been there for years. I'd ignored them, dressed them up as ambition, brushed them off as the price of success. But now the wound was wide open, and the infection had spread. It was time for surgery. When you've spent decades working in surgery, you learn that preparation is everything. The wrong angle, the wrong tool, the wrong timing, and the patient can bleed out before you've even realized your mistake. I wasn't planning to kill Rick. Not yet. Death, in my mind, was the least fitting punishment for him. I wanted something slower. Something that would take apart his empire, his pride, and his image piece by piece until there was nothing left but the man he truly was. The morning after I found the notebook, I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee and began writing. Not names, I'd already memorized those. This was a list of resources. Surgical gloves, non-latex. Scalpel set, size number 10 and number 15 blades. Alcohol wipes and sterile gauze. Lockpicks I could learn if I had to. Miniature camera with audio capability. Portable hard drive for file transfers. Blank checkbook from the business account. It looked like the shopping list of someone running both a clinic and a spy ring. In a way, that wasn't far from the truth. Rick's stroke recovery gave me the perfect cover. He needed physical therapy twice a week, medication refills every few days, and follow-up visits with his neurologist. That meant I had every reason to leave the house without arousing suspicion. To him, I was the dutiful wife again, organizing his pills in a plastic dispenser, driving him to appointments, making sure he ate something green once a day. He even started thanking me in small ways, as if a softer, gentler Rick might erase the decades of damage. But the truth was, his gratitude didn't touch me anymore. If anything, it made my skin crawl. I returned to each address in the notebook, but this time I didn't go inside. I watched. At Samantha Hale's condo, I saw her leave one afternoon with a man who wasn't Rick, mid-30s, wearing a Marina staff shirt. She laughed as he opened the car door for her. That gave me a strange sort of relief. Maybe she'd already cut ties with Rick. The downtown studio was still active. A young blonde woman in business attire entered with a portfolio and left 20 minutes later, looking equal parts excited and nervous. I noted the times, the license plate numbers, the flow of foot traffic. At the bungalow, the curtains were drawn most days. But one evening, just before sunset, I saw a different young woman emerge with a duffel bag, her eyes darting around like she was afraid of being followed. It wasn't hard to piece together the pattern. Rick rotated his protégés like stock in a showroom, bringing some in, phasing others out, always keeping the inventory fresh. The first tool I bought was the camera. Small enough to hide in a tissue box or wedge between books, but powerful enough to record in low light. I placed one in his study, angled toward the desk. Within a week, I had my first useful footage, Rick sitting at the desk, speaking on the phone in a tone that could only be described as intimate. He referred to arrangements, your next trip, and don't worry about the rent. Every file went straight to my portable hard drive. Next on my list was the business account. Rick had always managed our finances, or rather, controlled them. He handled the dealership's books, the real estate ventures, even the household budget. My clinic had its own account, but for the rest, I'd always deferred to him. That changed when I called his accountant, a man named Victor who had worked with Rick for over a decade. "I'm helping Rick manage things while he's recovering," I said smoothly. He asked me to get a copy of the last 3 years of records. Victor hesitated but eventually agreed, probably assuming Rick had already authorized it. When the documents arrived, I spent 3 nights at the kitchen table, highlighting transfers to shell companies I'd never heard of. Some were overseas. Others were registered to names that matched the women in the notebook. I now had proof, not just of infidelity, but of financial misconduct that could sink his empire. Old habits die hard, and surgical hands lose their edge without practice. In the weeks that followed, I began handling the scalpel again, not for patients, but on sheets of leather I'd ordered online. The texture wasn't identical to skin, but close enough to remind me of the precision required. Sometimes I'd test myself by making an incision exactly 2 inches long, then suturing it in under 30 seconds. It wasn't about harming him physically. It was about reminding myself that I still had the control, the skill, and the steady hands to see this through. My first real move came in the form of a letter. I mailed it from a post office 2 towns over, with no return address. Inside was a single printed photo from the camera in Rick's study, a still of him on the phone, smiling, the notebook open on the desk. Beneath it, I typed, "Does your wife know about the Future Horizons program?" I sent it to the board of directors for one of his yacht dealerships. 2 weeks later, Rick mentioned over dinner that there'd been some ridiculous rumor going around the office. He laughed it off, saying the board knew better. I smiled back, sipping my wine. I hadn't expected one letter to dismantle him. This was just a test, to see how easily I could reach into his world and twist the threads. By late September, I had everything I needed: recordings, financial records, a growing list of contacts connected to the program. All I lacked was the moment. It came sooner than I expected. Rick's neurologist scheduled a final evaluation for October 14th. If all went well, he'd be cleared for full travel again. That gave me exactly 3 weeks to act while he was still confined to the Bay Area. 3 weeks to pull the rug out from under him without him seeing it coming. In those 3 weeks, I became the perfect wife on the surface. I drove him to his therapy sessions, cooked his favorite meals, even laughed at his old jokes. At night, I lay beside him, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing, thinking about the years I'd spent trying to preserve a marriage that had been hollow for so long. Justice, I decided, wasn't about rage. It was about balance. And Rick had tipped the scales too far for too long. By the time October rolled in, Clearwater Bay had started to slip into its mild autumn, cooler breezes rolling off the water, the kind of golden light that made the yachts in the marina look like pieces of jewelry. It was the perfect season for Rick's downfall. I started with them. The women in the notebook weren't just names on paper anymore. They were people with stories, choices, and in some cases regrets. But I wasn't there to judge them. I was there to arm them. Samantha Hale opened her condo door with the same wary look she'd given me weeks ago. This time, I didn't bother with pleasantries. I handed her an envelope containing photographs, financial transfer records, and a copy of her own application form for the Future Horizons program. "I'm not here to hurt you," I said quietly. "I'm here to tell you you're not the only one." Her face changed, not relief exactly, but a kind of stunned recognition. "How many?" she asked. "Enough to shut him down," I replied. "But I need your voice." She didn't commit on the spot, but 2 days later, she texted me from a new number. "I'm in." The same conversation, in different shades, played out at the downtown studio and the bungalow. Some women were angry, others defensive, but by the end of the week, I had 4 willing to speak on record if the time came. Rick's empire was rooted in the marina, the dealership, the charters, the yacht club connections. If I could sour his reputation there, it would ripple outward. I started with a single USB drive, left anonymously in the yacht club's mailroom. On it were excerpts from the financial records showing business funds being funneled into housing stipends for the women in the notebook. No explanation. No signature. Just raw data that could only lead to questions. Within days, I overheard snippets of conversation when I visited the club under the guise of picking up Rick's mail. Words like embezzlement, misconduct, and conflict of interest floated around like oil slicks on water. Clearwater Bay was small enough that its gossip traveled fast, but big enough that local journalists were always hungry for a story that could get picked up nationally. I called a reporter I'd once treated at my clinic, a woman named Marisol Vega. She remembered me, and she owed me a favor. I have a file, I told her. It's about Richard Grant. It involves women, money, and a program that doesn't exist the way he says it does. There was a pause. You know this could be messy, she said. I'm counting on it. I gave her just enough to get her interested: names, dates, a few select documents, but kept the most damaging pieces to myself for the final blow. All the while, at home, nothing changed. I still made Rick's oatmeal in the mornings, still drove him to therapy, still helped him button his shirts when his right hand wouldn't cooperate. If he noticed my absences during the day, he didn't mention them. Maybe he thought I was finding my own ways to keep busy now that the kids were grown and the clinic was running smoothly without me. Sometimes I caught myself studying his face as he watched TV or read the paper. Did he know? Could he sense the walls closing in? But no, Rick was still Rick. He believed his charm and connections made him untouchable. That arrogance was the one tool I didn't have to steal. It was built into him. The most surprising ally I found was Victor, the accountant. I hadn't planned on telling him the full truth, but when I returned to request older records, he leaned forward across his desk. I've been wondering when someone would ask, he said. It turned out he'd known for years that Rick was moving money in questionable ways. But without a client's permission, he couldn't go public without risking his license. If you already have the documents, he said, I can walk you through what each one means in plain English. That way, if you hand them to the authorities, they'll know exactly what they're looking at. It took us 4 afternoons, but by the end, I had a binder so meticulously organized it could have been used in court tomorrow. On October 12th, 2 days before his neurologist's final evaluation, I set the trap. I told Rick I'd scheduled a small dinner at the yacht club to celebrate his recovery. He seemed pleased, even a little touched. What he didn't know was that I'd also invited Marisol, the reporter, under the pretense of being an old friend of mine. And in her bag was a hidden recorder. Over dinner, Rick played the charming host. But when Marisol steered the conversation toward mentorship programs, his ego couldn't resist. He started talking, vaguely at first, then with more detail than he realized, about helping women find their footing in the industry. By the time dessert arrived, he'd all but confirmed the existence of future horizons and hinted at exclusive arrangements with certain participants. The morning of October 14th, I drove Rick to his evaluation. While he was inside with the neurologist, I parked in the lot and sent a single email from an anonymous account. Attached were the financial records, the photographs, excerpts from the recordings, and a brief summary of the women's statements, all neatly compiled in Victor's annotated binder. The recipients were carefully chosen. The yacht club board, 3 marina investors, 2 local journalists besides Marisol, and an anonymous tip line for financial crimes at the state attorney's office. By the time Rick returned to the car, smiling faintly at his clean bill of health, the first notifications were already pinging on my phone. It didn't take long. By that evening, Marisol's article was live online, and the local news was running with the headline, "Prominent Clearwater Bay businessman under investigation for financial misconduct and exploitation allegations." At home, Rick was still in the dark. He was in the den, sipping a whiskey, while my phone buzzed with messages from Samantha and the others. "It's out. Thank you." When the first call came from one of his investors, he frowned and stepped outside to take it. 10 minutes later, he came back in pale and tight-lipped. "Strange rumors going around," he muttered. "Probably nothing. I didn't look up from my book." Probably. The morning the police came, the air in Clearwater Bay felt heavier, a storm brewing offshore. The sky tinted with that strange, metallic hue that always precedes a downpour. 2 officers stood at the door, their uniforms crisp, their expressions unreadable. One read the warrant aloud while the other stepped past me into the house. Rick emerged from the den, his whiskey glass still in hand. "What the hell is this?" "We have a warrant to search the premises for financial records, Mr. Grant," the first officer said. I stood in the kitchen doorway, silent, watching the man I'd been married to for 46 years try to talk his way out of something he couldn't charm his way around. They went through everything: his study, the safe in our bedroom, even the locked cabinet in the garage where he kept old dealership files. I could see the panic building in him, the way his jaw tightened each time they carried another box out to the car. When they found the hidden compartment in his desk, he looked at me for the first time since they arrived. His eyes were sharp, searching. I gave him nothing. By noon, the story had spread beyond Clearwater Bay. The Miami Herald had picked it up, then a Tampa news station, and by nightfall it was running on national outlets. Florida business mogul investigated for fraud, exploitation scheme. The photographs from Marisol's article were everywhere: Rick shaking hands with politicians, smiling at charity events, standing in front of one of his yachts. But now those images looked different. The smiles looked sharper, the handshakes more calculated. At the yacht club, whispers turned to open condemnation. Investors pulled out. A marina deal he'd been negotiating collapsed overnight. It was 3 days after the raid when Rick finally cornered me in the kitchen. "You," he said, his voice low but shaking, "did this." I didn't flinch. "You did this, Rick. I just made sure people saw it. You've destroyed everything." His face flushed red, and for a second, I thought he might throw the glass he was holding. Instead, he set it down hard enough that it cracked. "Why? After all I've given you." I looked at him then, really looked, and realized that in his mind, everything he'd given me outweighed everything he'd taken. "You didn't give me a marriage," I said. "You gave me a stage to stand beside you while you played the hero. And you used that stage to ruin other women's lives." That night, I packed a single suitcase and moved into the small apartment above my clinic. Daniel and Claire called, concerned, but I told them not to worry. I wasn't leaving town. I was just leaving the part of my life where I shared a roof with Rick Grant. Legally, we were still married. But the investigation had frozen most of his accounts, and he couldn't move property without my signature. For the first time in years, I was the one holding the pen. Within weeks, Samantha and the others I'd spoken to began telling their stories publicly. One wrote an op-ed for the Tampa Bay Times. Another spoke in a televised interview about how the mentorship program had turned into something coercive. Each time a new piece aired, Rick's name sank further. He stopped going out, stopped answering calls. The man who had once been the loudest voice in any room was now hiding in his own house, blinds drawn. When the state attorney's office announced formal charges, fraud, misappropriation of funds, and 2 counts of exploitation, I knew the real punishment had begun. Even if he avoided prison, the trial would strip him of what he valued most: his reputation, his access, his illusion of control. And I had one last piece to play. On the morning of his first court appearance, I sent him an envelope by courier. Inside was the leather-bound notebook, its pages marked with the names, addresses, and dates I had memorized months earlier. I'd added one final entry at the back: October 14, 2022, Clearwater Bay Medical Center, neurologist's office. No explanation. Just the date and place where his recovery had given me the perfect window to destroy him. Later that afternoon, I watched from the courthouse steps as he arrived, flanked by his lawyer. He looked older than I'd ever seen him, shoulders stooped, skin pale, eyes scanning the crowd like he couldn't tell who might be there to spit in his direction. When his gaze swept past me, I didn't look away. The months that followed were quieter than I expected. I ran the clinic. I took walks along the marina without feeling the knot in my stomach that used to tighten whenever I saw one of Rick's yachts. I even started attending a pottery class, shaping clay into bowls and vases, my hands steady and unhurried. Rick's trial dragged on. There were delays, motions, negotiations. I didn't go to every hearing, only the ones where I knew my presence would be noticed. By the time the verdict came, most of Clearwater Bay had already written him off. He was found guilty on several counts of fraud and ordered to pay restitution that would wipe out what was left of his fortune. Prison time was minimal, 2 years, but I knew that for a man like Rick, the loss of status was the real sentence. The day before he reported to serve his time, Rick asked to see me. Against my better judgment, I agreed. We met in the visitors' lounge of the county jail. He looked at me for a long moment before speaking. "You could have just left," he said. "I did," I replied. "But leaving doesn't fix the damage. It just walks away from it. And I wasn't willing to let you keep doing this to other people." He shook his head slowly, as if he still didn't understand. Or maybe he did, and understanding was worse. When they called time, I stood. He didn't reach for me. Neither of us said goodbye. Now, when I walk along the docks, I sometimes catch whispers of his name, usually followed by the word scandal, trial, or shame. I don't correct the details when people get them wrong. The truth is already out there, and it's enough. I keep the scalpel set on my desk at the clinic, not because I need it anymore, but because it reminds me of something I almost forgot. Precision matters. Whether in surgery or in justice, you don't rush the cut. You make it clean, deliberate, and at exactly the right moment. Rick taught me that, though not in the way he intended. So, if you've found strength in these words, if they've stirred something in you, I ask this of you: leave a piece of yourself behind. Share your story. Let it echo in the spaces you've been silenced. Like, comment, or subscribe, not for me, but for the next voice waiting to be heard.